You ever get that feeling like you're trying to stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah.
Whether it's for a big meeting or just trying to wrap your head around something totally new.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But there's just so much information out there these days. It can be so overwhelming trying to keep up with it all.
It really can. And that's actually a big part of why we're doing this deep dive today. You send over some really interesting research papers.
Right.
And we're going to focus on one in particular that tackles this challenge head on.
Okay.
How do we identify those really significant scientific trends right as they're emerging?
Yeah. How do we get in on the ground floor, so to speak, when it comes to new research directions?
Exactly.
It could have such a huge impact, right? I mean, think about funding and policies, all that. If you can spot those early signals, you're at a real advantage.
Absolutely.
So this paper you shared, it's called Leap2Trend, a temporal word embedding approach for instant detection of emerging scientific trends. And it looks like a pretty unique way to approach this whole thing.
It really is. It's by Dridi, Gaber, Azad, and Mogul.
Okay.
And it was published back in December 2019. And their idea is basically, can we see these trends almost in real time using a new approach?
Okay, so let's get into the specifics here. Because it seems like the way we've traditionally looked for these trends has been, well, kind of backward looking, right? Just counting citations and seeing what's gotten the most attention after the fact.
Right, that's the traditional method. Citation analysis, it's been the go-to for ages. You figure the more a paper gets cited, the more important it is, the more it signals a new area of research. But as the authors of this paper point out, there are some pretty big downsides to that approach. The main one being the time lag.
Yeah, it takes forever.
It takes months, sometimes years, for a paper to rack up enough citations to really be considered part of a trend.
Right, so you publish something, and then you're just kind of sitting there waiting for people to even read it, let alone use it in their research and then cite it. And by the time those citation numbers actually start to mean something, well, the trend might have already taken off, and you've missed that initial insight.
Exactly. And maybe even more importantly, just counting citations doesn't actually tell us what's driving the trend in the first place. It doesn't look at the content of the research to see how the language and the focus are changing, those subtle shifts that might be the very first signs of a new direction.
Makes sense.
They even talk about this idea of sleeping beauties, these groundbreaking papers that maybe don't get recognized for a decade or more, at least not through citations.
Sleeping beauties. I like that.
Right.
Okay, so if counting citations is too slow and it doesn't really look at the details, what else have people tried? I know there's been some work with using computers to actually analyze the text of the papers, like looking for recurring topics and stuff.
You're right, there has. There's been this move towards what are called content-based methods, using things like topic models. And the idea is to try and identify emerging areas by looking at the keywords and themes that are showing up in the research itself.
Okay, so instead of just seeing who's citing who, you're looking at the actual ideas, the words that are popping up more and more in the research.
Exactly.
That makes sense, like a more direct way to approach it. But the paper does mention a problem with these topic models, right? Something about how they don't always pick up on those pairwise associations between keywords.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Topic models are good at spotting general themes, but they can miss the connections, the merging of specific keywords. And those specific pairings could be the very first hints of a new trend taking shape. Like, think about their example of deep learning.
Okay.
That field really exploded when the ideas of machine learning and neural networks started to come together.
Right.
A topic model might have identified both machine learning and neural networks as important, but it might have missed that crucial connection forming between them.
So it's not just that both those concepts are popular, it's that they're actually merging into something entirely new.
Right.
Got it. And so this is where Leap2Trend comes in, right?
That's
This is
it.
their new method aimed at fixing those limitations, getting that instant detection, and focusing on the content itself.
That's it. Leap2Trend is designed to overcome the weaknesses of both traditional citation analysis and those earlier content-based approaches.
Okay.
And the key is using what are called temporal word embeddings. And specifically, they use the word to-vec model.
Okay.
And it tracks how similar keywords are over time.
Temporal word embeddings.
Yeah.
Let's unpack that a little. We know word embeddings can capture the meaning of words, right?
Right.
Like by placing them in this multi-dimensional space where words used in similar contexts end up closer together.
Exactly.
But what makes them temporal?
That's the important part. Instead of training one word embedding model on all the research papers at once, They train multiple models.
Okay.
Each model is trained on the papers published in a specific time period, so they can see how the meaning of keywords, or at least their relationships to each other, change over time.
So they're basically learning how these words are being used and what they mean in different slices of time.
Exactly.
Which lets them see which keywords are kind of moving closer together in the scientific literature.
Precisely.
That's pretty clever.
Ah.
So by measuring how that distance shrinks, they can identify when those once separate concepts are starting to merge and maybe form the basis of a new trend.
Exactly. And focusing on these specific keyword pairs, how their relationship changes, is how Leap2Trend picks up on signals that those broader topic models might miss.
Okay, I'm following. So the paper says Leap2Trend does all this in 4 main stages.
Right.
What are they?
So first, you've got data preprocessing.
Okay.
Getting the research papers ready for analysis, both in terms of the language and the timeline. Then there's word embeddings, which is where they train those time-specific word-to-vec models.
Yes.
Then similarity computation, actually measuring how close those keywords are in those embedding spaces. And finally, post-processing, which is taking those scores, ranking them, and then identifying the trends.
All right, good roadmap.
Yeah.
Let's go a little deeper on some of these stages, starting with data preprocessing. What kind of cleaning up are we talking about, and how do they deal with the whole time aspect?
So for the language preprocessing, they did some standard stuff like removing what are called stop words, common words like the, of, a that don't really carry much meaning.
Right.
They used a standard list of those words, but then they added a custom list of stop words that are common in research papers.
Okay.
Things like introduction, conclusion, that sort of thing.
Makes sense.
And then, interestingly, they also extracted big grams, which are those 2-word phrases like machine learning, neural network.
Okay.
Those are super common in scientific language.
Right.
And often represent important concepts. They actually considered using trigrams, too, which are 3-word phrases, but they decided against it.
Why is that?
Well, because in a lot of scientific fields, abbreviations are used more often, like CNN instead of convolutional neural network,
Okay, so they're trying to capture those key 2-word phrases that represent a specific idea.
Exactly.
But not get bogged down in the longer combinations that are used less consistently, especially with all those abbreviations.
Exactly.
What about the time-based preprocessing? How did they organize the papers chronologically?
So here, they actually explored 2 different approaches, incremental windows and sliding windows.
Okay, let's start with incremental.
With incremental windows, they started with the earliest year in their data.
Okay.
And then for each following year, they added all the papers from that year to the collection of papers from all the previous years.
So like building up a library of research over time.
Exactly. So for example, the data for 2008 would include all papers published up to and including 2008. And they did this on an annual basis because that's typically how academic publishing works.
Right. Makes sense.
Back.
What about sliding windows? How is that different?
With sliding windows, they used a fixed 3-year window. So for a given year, let's say 2008 again, the data would include papers from 2007, 2008, and 2009.
Okay.
Then as they moved to the next time step, the window would slide along. So for 2009, it would be 2008, 2009, and 2010.
I see.
And they chose this 3-year window based on research that showed it's a good time frame for tracking how scientific topics change.
Okay, so incremental is looking at the whole history of research up to a point.
Yeah.
While sliding is more like a snapshot of what's happening right now.
Precisely.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the papers prepped. Now let's talk about the second stage, word embeddings. They use the word 2-vec model, right?
Yeah, they went with word2vec, specifically with the skipgram architecture.
Okay.
And the reasoning was twofold. First, word2vec is a really well-established technique used all over in natural language processing. And second, a lot of studies have shown that it's really good at capturing the relationships between words. The basic idea behind the skipgram model is it tries to predict the words that are likely to appear around a given target word.
Okay, so if the target word is algorithm, it'll try to guess words like efficiency, complexity, or implementation.
Exactly. It's like it's playing a game, trying to figure out the words that go together, which helps it understand their connections.
And I think the paper even had an equation in there describing how it calculates the probability of predicting a context word. It was a bit technical, but basically it's all about figuring out those co-occurrences.
Right, exactly. The model's learning by looking at how often words appear near each other in the text. And the authors really stress how important it was to fine-tune the model's settings. They talk about something called hyperparameter tuning.
Okay.
Basically tweaking the model's parameters, like how many dimensions the word vectors have and the size of the context window. And instead of just using the default settings, they did this really detailed domain-specific optimization based on something called k-nearest neighbor stability.
And what's that all about?
It's basically making sure that the words the model identifies as most similar to a given word stay consistent, even if you change the model's settings a bit. They even reference their previous work on how they found the optimal values for these settings, and they ended up using a vector dimensionality of 200 and a context window of 6 for their data sets.
So they really customized word2vec to the specific characteristics of scientific writing.
Exactly. They didn't just use it straight out of the box.
Got it. And then they trained these word embedding models using both the incremental and sliding window approaches we talked about.
That's right. For incremental windows, they actually tried 2 different ways of training the embeddings. First, they called it fresh embedding, where they retrained the word2vec model from scratch for each year, using all the data up to that point. And then second, they tried updated embedding, where they started with the model from the previous year and just updated it with the new data.
Got it.
And for sliding windows, they just trained a completely new word2vec model for each 3-year window.
Okay, so we've got the research papers prepared, the word embeddings trained, all good. Now, what about the third stage, similarity computation?
Oh.
How did they measure how close those keyword vectors were in those models?
They used something called cosine similarity,
Okay.
which is a pretty common way to measure how similar 2 vectors are.
Right.
And in this case, it tells you how close the meanings of the 2 keywords are based on their word embeddings.
Okay.
Basically, it looks at the angle between the 2 vectors in that multidimensional space.
Okay.
So a smaller angle means they're more similar in meaning. And they did this for each time period, and for each model they trained, they created what's called a similarity matrix,
Okay.
which basically stores the cosine similarity score for every single pair of keywords. And they focused on the most frequent keywords, just to make the computations manageable.
Right. You can't analyze every word in the dictionary. Makes sense. Okay, so now they have these matrices of keyword similarity scores for each time step.
Exactly.
Now comes the exciting part, post-processing. How they pinpoint those rank ascents that signal a new trend is emerging.
Right. So the first step in post-processing is ranking. They take that similarity matrix, and for each time period, they create a ranked list of all the keyword pairs based on how similar they are. So the pairs that have the highest similarity, meaning they're closest in meaning in that time period, end up at the top of the list.
Right.
And they focus on just the top part of the matrix to avoid redundancy, since the similarity between, say, machine learning and neural networks is the same as between neural networks and machine learning.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay, so for each year or each 3-year window, they have this ranked list of keyword pairs with the most semantically similar ones at the top. Now, how do they figure out where those big jumps in ranking are?
This is where the leap in Leap2Trend comes in.
Okay.
They look at how the ranking of each pair changes from one time period to the next. So they calculate the difference in the rank.
Okay.
And if a keyword pair moves way up the list in the next time period, that suggests that those 2 words are becoming much more closely related in the research.
I see.
And that's a strong sign of a potential new trend. They actually set thresholds for how big this change in rank has to be.
Okay.
They call it delta. So a smaller change is a jump.
Yeah.
And a larger change, one that crosses a certain threshold they call theta, is a leap.
Leap, got it.
And they were mainly interested in these upward movements, the jumps and the leaps, as their signals for emerging trends.
So a big jump in the rankings means these 2 keywords have suddenly become much more associated in the research.
Exactly.
And that's a sign that something new is forming around those 2 concepts.
Precisely. And that's how they get that instant detection.
Right.
They're looking at those shifts in how words are being used in the research itself, rather than waiting for citations, which can take forever.
It all sounds very promising. But how do they know for sure if these detected ascents are really pointing to real-world trends in science?
That's where the experimental study and evaluation comes in.
Right.
To really test their method, they used it on 2 large scientific data sets.
Okay.
The first was NIPS, which is a huge conference in computer science, and their data covered 1987 to 2017.
Okay.
And then the second was MICAI, which is a leading conference in medical image computing, with data from 2004 to 2018. They specifically chose these two different fields to see if their method worked across disciplines.
Right, good test. And they needed some kind of benchmark, right?
Yeah.
Something to compare their Leap2Trend results against to see how well it was doing. They called this a gold standard, and I think they used two different ones, Google Trends hits and Google Scholar citations.
Exactly. They used Google Trends data, which is a measure of how much people are searching for certain topics online. They figured if a trend is really taking off, it's probably going to show up in search engine data as well.
Makes sense.
So for each keyword pair that Leap2Trend identified as having a big jump in ranking, they looked at the Google Trends data for those terms in the 3 years after the ascent.
Okay.
Then they calculated the slope of those search numbers over time.
So a positive slope means people are searching for those terms more and more.
Exactly. And they chose that 3-year window to line up with the way they had pre-processed the data.
Makes sense. It's like connecting the abstract world of research with the real-world interest that shows up in search engines.
Right.
And the second gold standard they used was Google Scholar citations.
Yeah. Google Scholar is that huge database of academic publications.
Right.
And the number of citations a paper gets is still a big deal in science. So for each keyword pair, they looked for papers that specifically mentioned both keywords in the title. And then they used a software tool to get the total number of citations for those papers. The idea was to see if the trends Leap2Trend found matched up with the actual citation patterns in the research.
So if Leap2Trend says a pair of keywords is trending, are more papers with those keywords in the title getting cited more often?
Exactly.
Okay. And how did they actually measure how well Leap2Trend was performing against these two gold standards? What were the specific metrics they used?
They mainly use 3 metrics. First, ascent accuracy, which is basically, out of all the ascents Leap2Trend detected, how many were followed by a positive slope in the Google Trends data.
So how often is it right when it predicts a trend?
Exactly. Then there's ascent recall, which measures how many of the actual trends, as shown by Google Trends, that Leap2Trend was able to find.
So how many real trends did it catch?
Right. And then the third one is ascent precision, which they actually measured in 2 ways. Precision against Google Trends, or PGT, and precision against Google Scholar, or PGS. And precision basically tells us how relevant the ascents that Leap2Trend found were compared to the gold standard.
Got it.
So they looked for a positive correlation between the Leap2Trend ascents and the trends in Google Trends, or the citation counts in Google Scholar. And they measured that correlation using Spearman's correlation coefficient, which basically tells you how well the rankings from the 2 data sets match up.
All right, so accuracy is how often Leap2Trend gets it right.
Yeah.
Recall is how many of the real trends it catches. And precision is how much its predictions match up with the evidence from Google Trends and Google Scholar.
Exactly.
Got it.
Now, for the actual keyword selection, they started by looking at the top 100 most frequent betagrams in the titles of the research papers.
Okay.
Then they narrowed it down to just the ones for which they could find Google Trends data.
Right. It has to be something people are actually searching for.
Exactly. That gave them a final set of 20 betagrams to analyze for each data set. And that number, 20, is actually similar to things like Google Hot Trends, which usually shows around the same number of the fastest rising search terms.
Interesting.
And they even reference some research that suggests there might not be that many truly new research topics popping up at any given time. It's not like a million new things are happening every day.
Right.
And importantly, as a way to test their concept, they used the same set of 20 keywords across all the different time spans they analyzed.
Okay, so a focused group of keywords for each data set. What did they find out about the accuracy of Leap2Trend?
Well, they found that the fresh embedding approach, where they retrained the word embedding models from scratch for each year using all the data up to that point, generally performed the best, especially when they set a higher threshold for what they considered a significant leap in ranking.
Interesting.
And the updated embedding approach, where they just updated the models each year, consistently did the worst, which suggests that for this kind of analysis, starting fresh each time might be better than building on old models.
It's like you need a clean slate to see the trends clearly.
Exactly. And they also saw that the bigger the jump in ranking, the more accurate the prediction tended to be.
So a really dramatic shift in how those keywords are related is a stronger signal that something big is happening.
Right. What about those average slopes they calculated for Google Trends hits? Did those back up the accuracy findings?
Yeah, what about those? Did those results match up with the accuracy they were seeing?
They did. The average slope of those Google Trends hits tended to go up as they used higher thresholds for an ascent,
Okay.
especially for the fresh embedding approach, which
Yeah.
tells us that those bigger leaps that Leap2Trend found really were linked to increases in public interest.
Right.
Although there was a little dip in the average slope for the sliding embedding approach on the MSCI dataset at the very highest thresholds, they thought that might be because those really big, sudden jumps in ranking were pretty rare in that particular dataset, which was also a bit smaller.
I see. What about, recall, how many of the real trends was Leap2Trend able to catch?
The recall rates were actually quite good, too. For NPS, the computer science dataset, fresh embedding had the best recall, meaning it was really good at spotting those trends that later showed up in Google Trends.
Okay.
For MICAI, the bioinformatics dataset, it was sliding embedding that had the best recall. They also noticed that fresh and updated embedding had similar recall rates for MICI, which they thought might be because that dataset was smaller overall compared to NPS.
Okay, so it looks like different word embedding strategies might be better for different types of data or maybe for picking up on different kinds of trends.
Right.
Did the authors give any examples of specific trends that Leap2Trend was able to identify? Real-world examples?
Yeah, they highlighted a couple of really interesting ones.
Okay, I like examples.
So for an NPS using fresh embedding, Leap2Trend found a significant leap with a rank change of 11 for the pair neural network machine learning between 2012 and 2013.
Okay.
And that's really interesting because it actually happened before the whole explosion of deep learning research, which started around 2014. Wow.
And the Google Trends data for those terms shows this huge spike in search interest right after that ascent was detected.
So it predicted the rise of deep learning a year in advance.
Yeah, just by looking at how those two words were being used together.
That's pretty amazing. What about an example from ManyCI, the bioinformatics side?
So for MECI, also using fresh embedding, they found a rank change of 10 for the pair lung cancer, breast cancer between 2009 and 2010.
Okay.
And they think this might be related to cancer statistics in the UK around that time.
Sure.
Lung cancer was the second most common cancer after breast cancer.
Right.
So maybe researchers were talking about these two types of cancer together more often.
Makes sense.
And again, Google Trends data for those terms shows a clear increase in searches after the detected jump.
So both of those examples really show the potential of Leap2Trend.
Yeah, they're pretty compelling.
Okay, so let's talk precision. How well did those ascents that Leap2Trend found actually line up with the data from Google Trends and Google Scholar citations? So for precision against Google Trends, what they call PGT, sliding embedding actually did a lot better than both of the incremental embedding methods. And that was for both the MPS and the MICAI datasets.
Okay.
They got pretty high precision rates, too. And they figured this might be because that 3-year sliding window of research papers matches up more closely with the kinds of searches people are doing on Google.
Right.
Compared to that long accumulated history captured by the incremental windows.
Okay, so for Google Trends, the shorter-term view of the research seemed to work better. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. It might be that the way people search online reflects those more recent shifts in research, rather than the long-term historical trends. And once again, updated embedding did the worst for precision against Google Trends. But importantly, for sliding embedding, they found a strong positive Spearman correlation, meaning there was a good match between the rank ascents and the Google Trends data.
Okay, so that shorter-term view really seems to work well for capturing public interest. What about precision against Google Scholar, PGS? Did that show similar results?
No, actually, it was quite different. For Google Scholar citations, incremental embedding did better than sliding embedding.
Okay, interesting. Why do you think that is?
Well, they figured that this makes sense because the way citations build up over time is more similar to that accumulating history that's captured in the incremental windows.
Right.
That shorter 3-year window doesn't really reflect those longer-term citation patterns.
Makes sense. So it seems like the best word embedding strategy really depends on what kind of real-world signal you're trying to predict.
Exactly.
Whether it's that more immediate public interest shown in searches or that longer-term academic impact measured by citations.
Right.
But overall, it sounds like their findings, using those two gold standards and all those different metrics, really point to Leap2Trend being effective at quickly finding those emerging trends.
Exactly. It's a very promising new way to see where science is heading, just by analyzing how the language is changing.
Okay, so big picture, the key takeaway is that Leap2Trend, with its temporal word embeddings, offers this potentially groundbreaking way to find those emerging scientific trends almost instantly,
Right.
just by looking at how keywords in research papers are changing their relationships over time,
Exactly.
which could really change how we understand how knowledge is created and evolves.
Absolutely.
Now, the authors do mention some limitations,
Right.
like the Google Trends data only goes back to 2004,
Yeah.
and it gives you relative search numbers, not absolute ones.
True.
Plus, they've mainly focused on those upward trends, the rank ascents. They suggest that future research could use other data sources for validation and maybe look at rank falls to see if they can identify declining research topics.
Yeah, there's always more to explore.
They also want to test Leap2Trend in other fields, like physics and biology.
Makes sense.
It really makes you think, if we can spot these emerging trends so quickly, how might that change how people learn, do research, or even just stay informed? Could tools like Leap2Trend give everyone a chance to see where science is going, even if they're not experts?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question.
It really is.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for diving into this research with me. It's been a great discussion.
My pleasure. It really shows what's possible when you combine computational linguistics and the study of scientific discovery.
Absolutely. Until next time.